everyone, welcome back to Needle Workshop. My name is Emily and today we'll be revisiting an old tutorial for one of our best sellers, the Japanese school uniform shirt. It's the same pattern that is also available in the Japanese uniform bundle. We've had a lot of people request a better video tutorial for this piece and we've finally come around to filming one. This video will also cover how to sew the shirt from the open shirt uniform bundle, since both patterns are sewn in the exact same way with some minor differences. These differences will be pointed out in the video when necessary. I should also mention that both these patterns have been slightly updated for an even better fit and are both available online. As per usual, all our patterns come with super detailed written tutorials that include tons of extra information that you won't find here in the video, such as a measurement guide, a printing guide, some material suggestions, and tons of pictures and graphics to help you through the tutorial. As always, we recommend making a mock-up before starting. No two bodies are the same, so making a mock-up allows you to tweak and adjust the pattern to make sure that the fit is just right for you. So fun fact, we've made a full vlog on the importance of adjusting your pattern and making mock-ups, which should be coming out really soon. I'm sure it can provide a lot of useful information for a beginner seamstress. Also important to note is that the seam allowance for these patterns is 1 centimeter wide, unless specified otherwise. And now, without any further ado, let's start with the tutorial. To begin, we will be sewing all our darts at the back bodice piece. I went ahead and marked every dart on the wrong side of the fabric using tracing paper and a tracing wheel. For a closer look on how to do that, feel free to check out our short video on the subject. Additionally, I'd recommend testing your tracing paper on a scrap piece of fabric and making sure it washes out properly. Depending on the company making the product, they can vary wildly in quality, and some of them do not in fact wash out properly and can stain your fabric. Make sure to pin all your darts in place before heading to the sewing machine. You can also mark out the lines using a washable sewing chalk. If your dart is at the edge of a sewing piece, you start by sewing at the edge with a back stitch and all the way down to the point. Make sure to go past that point while continuously sewing. Leave in a sewing tail of roughly 3 centimeters and cut. If your dart is a central dart, start at one point with a back stitch and then sew all the way down to the other point. Make sure to go past that point while continuously sewing. Again, leave a sewing tail of roughly 3 centimeters and cut. Your dart will need to be ironed down. I recommend getting a sewing ham to facilitate this process. If you intend on applying any prints or motifs on the back of your shirt, this is the time to do it. There are many options you can use to do this: iron on vinyl, fabric paint, or even applique. Personally, I'm using my Cricut to cut out my design in iron on vinyl and then using my iron to iron it on. You can also cut vinyl by hand and still apply it using an iron. Before moving on to our front bodice pieces, finish the hem of the back of your shirt by turning it in twice by 1 centimeter using your iron to flatten it down. And then you can top stitch the hem into place. Take out your front bodice pieces. This particular pattern has no darts at the front. The first thing we'll need to do is sew in our welt pocket on the left front side. Depending on the cosplay you are trying to do or whatever design you are trying to emulate, you might need to apply one at the right hand side as well, or exclusively at the right hand side. To know where your welt pocket goes, use your pattern piece as a template to mark the placement. Once again, I'll be using tracing paper with a tracing wheel to do this. Make sure to mark your long horizontal line as well as the shorter vertical lines. Also important is to add interfacing at the back where your welt pockets will be sewn. You can use the pattern as a reference for this as well. The front bodice is also going to need interfacing at the center front. You will need this on both yourself and the lining. We offer two different methods for applying a functional welt pocket. One is easier than the other, but is just a little bit less clean of a finish than the standard professional approach. Let's go over both methods and look at the difference of outcome once they're done. Let's start with the standard approach. You'll need the piece on which to apply the welt pocket with the marking drawn out on the right side of the fabric and the back side interfaced, your two welt pockets fully interfaced, your big pocket bag in the same fabric as the welt pocket, and your small pocket bag cut out of lining fabric. Now, right side to right side, align the notches of your first welt piece to the outer cross line of the welt pocket marker. To help you properly sew, you can mark the area to sew before sewing. The distance away from the edge at which you'll be sewing can vary depending on the finished width of the welt pocket. For this particular project, you'll be sewing
1.5 centimeters
away from the edge. You'll always be sewing starting and ending exactly where the notches are, so you can draw out those lines as well to help you sew. It's very important to start sewing exactly where the notches of the welt are and making sure you also don't backstitch outside of that. You can take your time to sew steady and straight, and also making sure to stop exactly where the other notch of the welt is. You'll be repeating this process by placing your second welt pocket opposite the line of the marker. It's also very important to properly align the notches of the welts to each other. You can use your ruler to mark out a perfectly aligned line between the two. Once again, you'll be sewing
1.5 centimeters
away from the edge for this project. Once again, you'll want to keep your sewing exactly at the notch and make sure not to go outside or stop inside of the notches. This is what will guarantee a well-aligned welt pocket. At this point, you'll want to cut your marking open. Important here, you'll want to cut along the line and stop at the inner cross lines. Next, you'll want to cut at an angle from the inner cross line all the way to the end of your stitches, stopping about 1 to 2 millimeters away from the stitch itself. You'll want to do this at both ends of the pocket towards all 4 stitch ends. Once the opening is fully cut, turn your welt pockets towards the inside of the piece. You'll notice here that I forgot to apply the interfacing at the back side of my sample. Don't do that, and make sure to apply it to your garment. It's really important for the longevity of the garment itself. Pull your welt pockets away from the opening and iron the seam flat. Then pull in your dovetails and also iron those flat. Dovetails are those little sections right here. Pull your welts back in and iron the seam allowance open on each side. Fold your welt pocket roughly in half, wrong side to wrong side, using the seam allowance as a guide to know where to fold. Do this on both sides, making sure the welt pockets align at the center of the opening. Iron everything flat. Take your big pocket bag and align it to the unsewn edge of the top welt, right side to right side. You'll want to pin together the bag, welt, and the seam allowance of the main piece and sew all of these pieces together. Make sure to keep your stitch on the seam allowance itself and not on the shirt. Now take the small pocket bag and right side to right side, align it to the unsewn edge of the bottom welt. Pin in place and sew them together 1 centimeter from the edge, making sure not to sew into the seam allowance this time. Iron the seam allowance open. Reposition the big pocket back down. Pin the pocket bags together. If you have any discrepancies at the bottom of the pocket bags, do not force them to align. Instead, make sure the welts remain properly positioned and we will cut off any excess at the bottom of the pocket bags. Okay, turn your piece over. Move the main piece out of the way to reveal the dovetails and pin the dovetails down to the welts. You'll want to sew the dovetails to the welt and pocket bags exactly at the fold of the dovetail. Now that we have everything pinned down, let's move to the sewing machine. Start by sewing at the upper right side, making sure to sew exactly along the fold of the dovetail. Continue making your way around the pocket bag. Your seam allowance here should be roughly 2 centimeters away from the edge. When you get to the dovetail, make sure to sew along that fold again. With that, your welt pocket is officially done for this video. If this technique looks a little daunting, let's take a look at the other option, shall we? For this version, you'll want to substitute the original marking for one meant for this version. This marking is provided with the pattern and should be drawn out on the wrong side of the fabric. Once again, you'll notice that I forgot to apply the interfacing at the back side of my sample. Don't do that and make sure to apply it to your garment. It's particularly important for this version of the welt pocket. You'll also need 2 welt pockets fully interfaced and a long single pocket bag. These pieces will be marked as being specifically for the simplified welt pocket. Start by folding your welt pocket in half, wrong side to wrong side, and ironing them flat. Right side to right side, so each welt in place at both ends of the long pocket bag. Take one end of the pocket bag and iron the bag away from the welt. This will allow you to align the 2 welts together. I realized after finishing my sample that you should go ahead and stitch around the opening before cutting along your markings. This will help reinforce the corners once they're cut. When cutting the dovetails, make sure to cut 1 to 2 millimeters away from the stitch. Iron the opening open by pulling the cuts towards the wrong side of the fabric. Take your welt pocket and center it with your opening. You can use a ruler to help properly align everything, or you can eyeball it. Pin the lower welt pocket in place, making sure to avoid pinning into the pocket bag. Move the other welt and bag out of the way and top stitch the lower welt in place on the main piece 2 to 3 millimeters away from the edge. Place the top welt back in place and pin in place. This time, you can pin the pocket bag in place at the sides of the opening. Top stitch in place at the top and sides, once again 2 to 3 millimeters from the edge. Sew the sides of the pocket bag down 1 centimeter from the edge. With that, your welt pocket is officially done. So what's the main difference between the two pockets? The main difference is that the first method completely hides all forms of stitching, while the second option has a clear top stitch visible on the outer side of the garment. There's also a small added weakness at the corners of the second option, which can be warded off with the added stitch mentioned earlier. Moving on with our piece, we're going to take back out our back bodice pieces and right side to right side, align the front bodice pieces to it at the shoulders. The length of the shoulders of the back bodice piece is a little longer than that of the front bodice pieces. This is completely normal. It's done this way so we can allow a little extra space, specifically for the scapula. Just make sure to stretch out the front when aligning the two shoulders to make sure that everything is properly aligned. Sew together 1 centimeter from the edge and iron your seam allowance open. We'll be repeating the same process with the back and front facing pieces, but before sewing them together at the shoulders, make sure to overlock the lower edge of the back facing piece. At this point, it's important for me to mention again that I forgot to apply my interfacing at the center front of the lining piece. I really don't recommend that you do that since we'll be sewing in snaps and buttons later, and the interfacing is very important if you want to avoid the notions from ripping off the fabric through repeated wear of the garment. Right side to right side, you can sew the back facing to the front facings at the shoulder. Once again, make sure to stretch the front shoulder to match the back shoulder and iron your seam allowance once it's sewn. Now comes the most tricky part that everybody struggles with, the collar. You'll have 3 pieces for this: the collar trim, and the undercollar. The trim and the undercollar should be the same color, and all pieces should be interfaced. Now let's start by sewing the trim in place. To help with this, I highly recommend marking out the seam allowance at the top of the collar and inner corners of the collar trim. The seam allowance is 1 centimeter, should be marked on the wrong side of the fabric, and should be marked with a chalk or pen that won't stain your fabric. My pink chalk was leaving residue on my white section, so I switched it out for my water-soluble marker on my second collar attempt. Making sure the pieces are facing wrong side up, right side to right side, position the right hand corner to each other, making sure you properly align the corners that we just marked out. I use a pin to make sure they are aligned perfectly. Now it's time to move to our sewing machine. Starting from the edge with the trim facing up, start sewing towards your marked corner. This is really important. You'll want to end your stitch exactly at the marked corner. Remember, we are sewing 1 centimeter away from the edge. Once you've planted your needle in that corner, raise your foot, take a small pair of clippers or scissors, and notch into that concave corner, stopping only 1 to 2 millimeters away from your needle. Now turn your collar towards the next edge to be sewn, and then adjust your trim to align the inner edge of the trim to the top edge of the collar. Because of that notch that we did into the concave corner, we can now move that section with relative ease. Sew down a few centimeters to secure in place. Before continuing our stitch, we'll need to pin down the rest of our collar. Make sure to align your notches and pin in place. Like we did before, you'll need to align the marked out corner of the trim and collar to each other on the other side of the collar. Once that's all pinned down, we can continue with our sewing. Again, make sure to stop your needle exactly where the corner is marked out. Take your clippers or small scissors and again, cut into the concave corner of the trim, making sure to stay 1 to 2 millimeters away from the needle. Realign both your collar and trim to finish sewing in place. Now, if like me you used a water-soluble pen, now's a good time to erase it since applying heat to water-soluble pens can sometimes turn it into a permanent stain. If your corners are puckering, you can try cutting a little deeper into your concave area to help relax the fabric. You'll also need to cut off some of the excess fabric from the collar before ironing the seam allowance open. Next, right side to right side, we'll be aligning our undercollar to our collar. Make sure to align the sides and the top edge and pinning everything down before sewing 1 centimeter from the edge. Cut off the excess fabric at the sewn corners. We'll also remove some thickness from the top edge by cutting off some of the seam allowance of the undercollar. To get some really clean results, we'll be sewing the undercollar to the seam allowance at the top edge. You can start and end your stitch about 3 to 4 millimeters away from the corners. Keep your stitch 2 to 3 millimeters away from the seam itself. This type of stitch is called an understitch and will help hide your seam towards the inside of the collar since it will naturally roll towards that direction. Turn your collar inside out, push out the corners, and proceed to iron down all of the collar. You can cut out any discrepancies at the lower edge and even out your collar. This next part is optional and will depend on your design preferences. If you want to add a stitch in the trim area, you can mark out the section to be stitched. I'm making sure to use a washable marker to do this, and I'm measuring out the center of the trim using a ruler. Sew the section in the trim with the thread color of your choice, and then stay stitch the lower edge of the collar. Your stay stitch should be about 5 to 7 millimeters away from the edge. Here are the 2 collars that I made. One of the models has a wider trim than the other, and both pattern options are available in the PDF. It is slightly easier to sew a larger trim, but only by a slim margin. I've also used a darker thread on my wider trim color to really make the stitch pop and make it look a little bit more cartoony. That is really just a design preference. Now it's time to sew our collar in place. We'll start by sewing the lower edge of the collar to the neckline of the facing. Where you see the buttonhole markings on my facing is actually the wrong side of the fabric. You don't need to have those marked down. It was an error on my end, but it will help understand the positioning of our collar, which is under collar to right side of the facing. Another very important point here is the collar needs to be placed in between the notches found at the front of the facing. Make sure to pin it in place so it does not skew out of place. If you are currently sewing the shirt from the open shirt uniform bundle, there won't be a notch, and instead, your collar will be positioned 1 centimeter away from the edge. The difference is simply that there is no front extension on this piece, and only the seam allowance needs to be taken into account. Also important is to align the shoulder notch to the shoulder seam and the back notches to each other. Use as many or as little pins as you need to help you sew the collar in properly. Once everything is pinned, you'll need to sew in place 5 to 7 millimeters from the edge. I find it easiest to sew with the collar facing downwards. Here's what it looks like so far. We're really starting to see it all come together. Now, right side to right side, you're going to place your main bodice piece to the facing and pin in place along the neckline. The collar will be sandwiched in between the two pieces. It's very important again to make sure that all the notches and seams are properly aligned. You also want to align the front bodice pieces with their matching facing and pin them together at the center front and at the hem. If you're currently sewing the shirt from the open shirt uniform bundle, the only difference you will encounter here is the lack of extension at the front and a differently shaped center front bodice. You'll still be sewing the same area shut, it'll just be shaped differently. Once everything is pinned down, go ahead and sew 1 centimeter all around, starting with the hem on one side, moving towards the center front, then towards the neckline, to the center front of the other side, finishing with the hem on the other side. Cut off the excess fabric at all the sewn corners. To make sure your collar sits comfortably around your neck, make sure to notch into the neckline. Be careful here not to notch into the stitch itself. Turn the piece inside out and carefully push out all the corners. Iron the center front and hem of the front bodice pieces flat. To keep the back facing laying flat, we'll need to top stitch it down. Pin the self to the facing along the collar, making sure everything is laying flat. We don't want any section to be bunching up. Starting at one end of the collar, top stitch in place 2 to 3 millimeters from the seam of the collar. I recommend doing this with the self facing up. Iron out your neckline and collar. And with that, your collar is installed. Next, we'll be stitching our self and facing together at the armhole. There are notches and seams you can use to align everything properly, but the most important part is to make sure that everything at the front bodice lays flat. If notches are slightly misaligned when everything is laying flat, then so be it. It's better to prioritize everything being perfectly flat. The misalignment can come from minor sewing imperfections, so we're going to cheat that to accommodate everything laying flat. Once everything is pinned down, sew together 5 to 7 millimeters from the edge. Now, right side to right side, align the front and back together at the side seams. Pin in place. And sew 1 centimeter from the edge, followed by overlocking the raw edge. Make sure to leave some excess overlock stitch at the hem, and using a larger needle, usually a quilting needle or leather needle, pull the excess stitch back into the stitch itself. You'll want to iron the seam allowance of the side seams towards the back bodice and stitch the seam allowance down at the hem. We now need to add some sleeves to our bodice. For your sleeve, you'll have the big sleeve, small sleeve, and cuff. Your cuff needs to be interfaced if it's from a lighter or flimsier fabric. Right side to right side, align the sleeves together at the inner arm edge. Sew together 1 centimeter from the edge and overlock your raw edge. Iron down your seam allowance towards any direction once it's sewn. Align the sleeves along the elbow edge, again right side to right side, making sure to properly align your notches. The middle section between the notches will need to be stretched out slightly on the small sleeve to properly align both edges. Again, the slight discrepancy is on purpose. It's to accommodate your elbow bend. Sew together 1 centimeter from the edge and overlock your raw edge. Iron down your seam allowance towards any direction once it's sewn. For the cuff, start by folding it right side to right side and sewing it together along the shorter length. Iron your seam allowance open. Wrong side to wrong side, fold in half along the longest length. Iron the piece flat. Right side to right side, align the raw edge of the cuff to the hem of the sleeve. The seam of the cuff should be aligning to the elbow seam, while the notch of the cuff will align with the inner arm seam. The cuff is slightly smaller in length than the hem of the sleeves, so you will need to stretch it out to match the hem. Alternatively, you can lightly gather the hem of your sleeve if you are struggling to stretch out the cuff. You'll need to sew them together 1 centimeter from the edge, followed by an overlock stitch. Turn your sleeve inside out and pull your cuff out, before then pulling the sleeve back over the cuff. Pull all around until you have about 1.5 centimeter of the cuff visible. Make sure to iron that fold in place. To hold the sleeve in place, we'll need to add a stitch in the ditch at the 2 seams found at the sleeves. Your stitch should start at the edge of your cuff and extend towards the hem by roughly 2 centimeters. Next, you'll need to lightly gather the crown of the sleeve. There are notches on the pattern that indicate where to gather. You'll need to position your sleeve to the armhole. Start by aligning your bottom notch to the side seam of your bodice. You have a single notch at the front that will align to each other. And a double notch at the back that align to each other. You also have a top notch that aligns to the shoulder seam of the shirt. The distance between your front and back notches and the notches of the crown should lay flat, while the gathered area should be dispersed as evenly as possible. Use as little or as many pins as needed to keep everything in place. You'll need to sew 1 centimeter from the edge, followed by an overlock to secure your raw edge. The seam allowance should be ironed towards the sleeve. Now for this project, I decided to switch out my sleeve for a specific character that I'm looking to cosplay. I've been working on a video vlog showing how I made the mock-up and all the pattern adjustments I made to make this piece fit exactly for my needs. I feel like this kind of information could be useful for a lot of beginners, so I highly recommend keeping an eye out on the channel for this upcoming video. We're almost done with our piece at this point. All we need now are some buttons and some snaps. Take out your front bodice pattern piece since it's a good reference to help us position everything. We're going to start with the buttonholes, which in most cases are situated on the left-hand side. This can vary from one character to another, so make sure to double check that. Make sure not to align your shirt to the edge of the pattern. Remember, we need to account for the seam allowance here. You can draw out the seam allowance to help properly position your pattern. Using your tracing paper and a tracing wheel, mark the position of the buttonholes using a cross shape, which would be this section of the pattern. Techniques for buttonholes vary from one machine to another. You'll need to check out your sewing machine guide to know exactly how to make them properly using your own equipment. We do have a rough overview available in short video format that you can check out if you want to, but I must stress that each machine works differently. Next is something I feel like a lot of cosplayers skip, but is actually very important to get a good fit at the neck. You'll want to sew in a hook and eye on the inside section of the collar. I personally recommend a larger format hook and eye to really help avoid any gapping at the neck. To prep your thread, cut a long piece of thread and fold in half. Take the 2 freestanding ends and insert them into your needle. you'll end up with a loop at the other end. This isn't the only way to prep your thread, it's just my personal preference. The other option is to create a knot at the end of your thread before starting your sewing. Sewing a hook and eye is the same technique for both sides. We'll start with our eye. I like to start securing both sides into place with a stitch. Makes it easier to stitch the rest in place afterwards. Notice the first stitch is secured in place by passing the needle through the thread loop. Once both sides have been secured in place, you'll want to start stitching all the way around each loop. Not only will this make your piece sturdier, it will also stabilize the hook and eyes so it doesn't shift around. This next part is optional, but you can add an additional stitch around the lower front portion of the hook and eye. Make sure to stitch back into a stitch and passing your needle through the loop to secure in place. I also like to thread one last time through the fabric before cutting the excess thread. I think the last stitch was unnecessary for an eye this small, but it can really come in handy for the hook section or larger eyes. Repeat the same process with the hook and you are done. Hook and eyes can come in several different sizes and formats, but the technique for sewing them in place by hand remains largely the same. To sew the buttons in, we'll use our buttonholes as guides. It's definitely easiest to properly position the top opening, so place a pin next to the left hand edge. Measure out how far your pin is from the right hand edge. Place several other pins the same length away from the edge. Use these pins as a guide to position the left hand side. Now using a chalk, mark each of the buttonholes opening onto the right hand side. All of your buttons should be the same distance away from the edge of your shirt. So, using the top as the main reference, adjust the positioning of all your buttons as needed. Remember that the cross line indicating the center of the button should be lining up with where the collar ends, since that is the true center front. Now go ahead and sew in all your buttons. There are different types of buttons that can be sewn in, but for a jacket of this style, I would personally recommend a shank button. Just in case you're looking to get another style sewn in, we'll be showing you how to sew both a shank button and a 4-hole button. The 4-hole button can be substituted for a 2-hole as well, but the technique remains the same. To prep your thread, cut a long piece of thread and fold in half. Take the 2 freestanding ends and insert them into your needle. You'll end up with a loop at the other end. This isn't the only way to prep your thread, it's just my personal preference. The other option is to create a knot at the end of your thread before starting your sewing. We'll start by sewing a shank button. They can sometimes have designs on them which you'll need to make sure to properly align with your garment. Start by securing your thread into the fabric where you've marked the placement of your button. I just insert my needle into my loop and done. Insert your thread into the shank and then do another stitch into the fabric. I do this 3 times for each button. To finish off my stitch, I'll wrap around my stitch at the lower part of the shank 3 times before stitching through the wrapped thread and securing my stitch in place by passing my needle through the thread loop. You can stitch through the wrapped thread a second time. Cut the thread and your shank button should be ready to go. Next, let's take a look at how to apply a 4-hole button. Once again, you'll want to secure your thread into the fabric. My second stitch is going to come at an angle since we'll be stitching the button in place with an X pattern. Insert your thread into the buttonholes diagonal from each other. Sew your thread back into the fabric at the same angle as before. Before proceeding to the next loop in the button, I'm going to make sure to leave some ease to my stitches. This is only necessary if the button is used in a closure system. It needs that ease to insert itself into a buttonhole. If your button is decorative, then you don't need any ease at all. I'm going to loop into my buttons 3 times total. Notice again the ease in my stitch. I'm going to move my thread over so I can start stitching in the opposite diagonal position. Again, I'm going to loop 3 times around the button while making sure to keep the same amount of ease as the previous stitches. When I'm done, I'm going to wrap my thread 3 to 5 times around my stitch under my button before stitching through the wrapped thread and securing my stitch in place by passing my needle through the thread loop. You can stitch through the wrapped thread a second time. Cut the thread and you are done. For the snaps, I recommend using the pattern once again as a rough template to position them. I personally eyeballed all the positions using the female sides of the snaps and then pinned them through to mark their position on the facing. Open the shirt up and place each male snap into place where the pins are sticking out. Remove the female snaps and place the pins into the male snaps. Don't forget to position your smaller snap at the top corner. Sew in place, making sure not to sew through the outer layer, since we don't want them to be visible on the outside of the garment. To apply the other side of the snaps properly, first, make sure to button up everything into place and to make sure everything is properly aligned. Then, take a bit of chalk and apply it to the tips of each male snap before pressing them into the right-hand side of the fabric. This will leave a clear mark as to where to position each of the female snaps, and it will align perfectly with its male counterpart. I'm saying male and female here because it's an easy way to distinguish between the two sides and is the general terms used in sewing. On another note, here are some instructions on how to sew the snaps. To prep your thread, cut a long piece of thread and fold in half. Take the 2 freestanding ends and insert them into your needle. You'll end up with a loop at the other end. This isn't the only way to prep your thread, it's just my personal preference. The other option is to create a knot at the end of your thread before starting your sewing. When sewing snaps, you can sometimes use a pin to help position them if the snap itself has a hole in the center. If it doesn't, you'll need to hold it in place with your hands. We'll start by stitching our snap in place on one side. My first stitch will be inserted into the loop at the end of my thread. This is only possible if you set up your thread like I did. You'll want to sew around each side of the snap 3 to 6 times or even more. This varies wildly depending on the size of your snap. When you're done, insert your needle through all the stitches and secure your stitch. If your snap ever comes undone on one side, this will secure the other sides from unraveling. Move your thread under the snap before starting your stitch into another side. At this point, you'll want to repeat the process until you finish sewing the snap at all sides. On the last side, make sure to insert your needle twice to secure your stitch in place. I also like to thread one last time through the fabric underneath the snap before cutting the excess thread. When sewing the female side of the snap, make sure it's facing the proper way with the indent facing up. Sew in the exact same manner as before. Button and snap everything up to make sure everything is positioned properly. You can add or remove buttons and snaps as needed according to whatever design you are trying to follow. And with that, we have finally finished our garment.
It's not a game, it's a rich thing.
Alright, so I think that covers everything for today's video. I really hope this new tutorial helps clarify some information and can help you bring your creations to life. If you want to learn more sewing techniques and little hacks to help improve your projects, I really recommend watching all of our supplemental videos, both in long form on YouTube and in short form on different social media outlets. There's just so much to share when it comes to sewing, and it can't always be shared in every video. Once again, we have a very cool vlog about how to adjust patterns and the importance of mock-ups coming up very soon. So make sure to stick around if you don't want to miss out on it. And I think that truly wraps up everything for today. So as always, good luck with your projects, guys. Bye bye.